On the cold afternoon of October 17th, 1944, in Zwickau, located in eastern Germany, Friedrich Conrad Steiner stamped his signature on a document that, under the dim light of that civil registry office, seemed to be just another bureaucratic procedure among thousands, a simple blank line that nobody would notice amid the administrative disorder of a Reich that was already beginning to crumble from within. However, that document was far from ordinary. It was a marriage certificate, and the name that appeared next to his, written in dark ink on German paper, was that of Margaret Waldmann, a Jewish woman, registered and marked by a system that never forgave exceptions. Friedrich was 32 years old at the time and worked in the civil administration in charge of population records and identity documents. He wasn't a soldier in the trenches, he didn't wear military decorations, nor did he fire weapons. His job consisted of filing forms, verifying names, processing transfers, and maintaining the order of the paper that sustained the state. And he knew perfectly well that in times of total war, whoever controls the paper also controls who keeps living and who disappears. Margaret was 27 years old and had been a philosophy teacher at a private school in Breslau. Before the Nuremberg laws stripped her of the right to teach, her father, Jakob Waldmann, had been a renowned historian before being erased from universities. Her mother, Sarah Rosenthal, died in 1942 after suffering a collapse in a munitions factory where she worked without a contract, and her brother, David Waldman, a recently graduated doctor, had disappeared 6 months earlier without leaving any trace. Margaret had taught German students about Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. She had led seminars on ethics and morality, and now she couldn't even enter a public library. Margaret wasn't in a concentration camp yet, but her name appeared on the lists, and when the Reich decided to call someone, it never asked twice. Friedrich didn't know her. Before that summer, he saw her for the first time in July, when she arrived at the office with an incomplete labor relocation form. She had been assigned to a textile factory on the outskirts of the city, and the document came with minor errors, misspelled numbers, missing signatures, errors that could be corrected with a quick visit or become grounds for immediate detention. He corrected the errors, not out of compassion, but out of routine, because his job was to keep the system running without questioning it. She returned 3 weeks later with another form that had inconsistencies. This time, Friedrich noticed something different. The origin stamp had been altered. Someone had tried to change her category from registered Jew to worker, without racial classification, a clumsy and obvious attempt for anyone trained in detecting forgeries. Friedrich could have reported her. He should have reported her. Instead, he filed the document without making comments. And that silence was the beginning of something neither of them planned. Weeks passed, and Margaret kept appearing, not because she wanted to, but because the system forced her. Every new decree, every inspection, every shift change meant a new form, and every form crossed Friedrich's desk. In August, during one of those visits, she accidentally dropped something, a small book with worn covers. Friedrich picked it up from the floor, and it was a pocket edition of Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. The pages were underlined in pencil and full of annotations in the margins. "Excuse me," she said, extending her hand. "It's the only thing I could keep." Friedrich returned the book without saying anything, but that night, while reviewing files in his empty apartment, he thought about that book, about the annotations, about someone who had dedicated years to teaching philosophy. and who now depended on forms to keep existing. It was in September when he understood the truth. She was being tracked, not openly nor with clear orders, but she was on several lists at the same time, lists that at some point would cross, and when that happened, Margaret Waldman would stop being a name on paper to become a number on a train. Friedrich wasn't a rebel. He wasn't part of any underground resistance. He didn't believe in the fall of the Reich, nor in the victory of the Allies. He believed in surviving, in going unnoticed, in keeping his head down until everything was over. But there was something in the system that he knew better than anyone. The Reich trusted its records more than its soldiers. Nazi bureaucracy was relentless, but also depended on correct forms, valid stamps, documents in order, and within that dependence there were cracks. One October night, while reviewing old files of civil marriages dissolved for administrative reasons, Friedrich found a specific case, an annulled marriage between a German classified as Aryan and a woman of mixed origin whose racial classification had been challenged. The marriage was never officially invalidated because the process remained incomplete. The man had died on the Eastern Front. The woman had disappeared, but the document still existed, filed, forgotten, technically valid. Friedrich spent 3 nights studying that file, verified dates, stamps, signatures, reviewed the Reich's marriage regulations, technical exceptions, ambiguous cases, and understood something few would dare to attempt. If an old and poorly filed civil marriage could remain in the records without attracting attention, a new marriage, discreet, without witnesses or a celebration, could do the same, not out of love, but out of logic. Because a Jewish woman married to an Aryan official entered an ambiguous category that confused the system, she didn't disappear from the records, but stopped being an immediate priority. Her legal status changed without really changing, and as long as the Reich had doubts about how to classify her, it wouldn't act, at least not immediately. Friedrich waited 2 weeks before talking to Margaret. He needed to be sure. He needed to verify every technical detail, every possible flaw in his plan, because if he made a mistake, they would both die. It was on the afternoon of October 10th when he finally told her. Margaret had arrived with another labor reassignment form. The office was empty. It was almost closing time. Friedrich locked the door. "There's a way to get you off the lists," he said without preamble. "It's not safe, it's not permanent, but it could buy you time." Margaret looked at him without understanding. Friedrich explained the plan, showed her the annulled marriage file, explained how racial categories worked within the bureaucratic system, showed her the regulations that created gray areas, technical exceptions, internal contradictions. If we marry civilly without ceremony, without witnesses, your classification changes. You don't disappear from the system, but you enter a category that takes months to process, and right now the system doesn't have months. It barely has weeks. Margaret remained silent for a long time, then asked, "Why would you do this?" Friedrich had no answer, or maybe he did, but didn't know how to express it. It wasn't love. He didn't know her well enough. It wasn't heroism. He didn't believe himself to be a hero. It was something simpler and more complex at the same time. It was the certainty that if he didn't do something, she would die, and he would spend the rest of his life knowing he could have prevented it because "I can," he finally answered. Margaret looked at him for several seconds, then asked, "And if they discover us, then they kill us both?" Friedrich didn't respond immediately. He knew that staying meant waiting for her turn on the list. He knew that fleeing without valid documents meant dying on a road, a forest, a train station. He knew there were no safe options, only decisions less fatal than others. When he finally asked, tomorrow or the day after, every day that passes, the lists consolidate more. Margaret nodded slowly. Then do it. On October 17, 1944, Friedrich and Margarete signed a marriage certificate in an empty office, without witnesses, without rings, without celebration. Friedrich used an official stamp that only he controlled. Margarete signed with her full name, knowing that this act could be her salvation or her sentence. The document was filed among hundreds of others. Nobody reviewed it. Nobody asked questions. The system accepted it because it came properly stamped. And so Margaret Waldman stopped being just a tracked Jew and became Margaret Steiner, wife of a German official, existing in a gray area that the Reich didn't know how to process quickly. If this story touched your heart, support it with your like and subscribe to not miss the next videos. Consider joining as a channel member. And if you like this content, click the thanks button to help the channel grow. Tell me in the comments from what city and country you're watching me from. I want to know from where you accompany those whom history wanted to silence. The marriage didn't solve everything. It changed Margaret's category in the files, but didn't erase her from all lists. There were previous records, crossed documents, prior racial classifications that still existed. Friedrich knew that, eventually, someone would notice the inconsistency. His only advantage was time and chaos, because in October 1944, the Reich was no longer the perfect machine it had been in 1939. Allied bombings were destroying complete archives. Administrative offices were constantly relocating. Officials were dying at the front or deserting. The system kept functioning, but with more and more errors, more delays, more internal contradictions. Friedrich used that chaos deliberately. Every time a form related to Margaret arrived at his desk, he delayed it. He didn't destroy it because that would have been too obvious. He processed it slowly, sent it to wrong departments, added technical notes that required additional verification, generated bureaucracy upon bureaucracy until the document was buried under layers of unfinished procedures. He developed a precise system. When an urgent document about Jewish population arrived, he mixed it with ordinary labor relocation requests. When a list consolidation order arrived, he added marginal notes about inconsistencies in marital classification that required legal review. When someone asked about Margaret Waldman, he showed the marriage certificate and explained that she was now Margarete Steiner. Category pending reclassification. It wasn't heroism, but administrative manipulation. It was using the system against itself. Margaret, for her part, stopped existing publicly. She didn't go out to the streets without reason, didn't talk to neighbors, didn't look for new work, lived in Friedrich's apartment as if she were a ghost. When there were inspections in the building, he showed the marriage certificate and explained that his wife was sick, confined, under private medical treatment. Nobody asked more. Nobody wanted to get involved. The first months were the most dangerous. In November, a Gestapo inspector appeared at the office asking about discrepancies in Jewish population records. Friedrich showed him 3 folders full of contradictory forms, explained that it was in the verification process, and suggested that the problem was in the Breslau offices that had been bombed months before. The inspector reviewed the papers for 20 minutes and then left. He never returned. In December, Margaret had high fever for 5 days. Friedrich couldn't call a doctor or take her to a hospital. Any official medical record would expose her. So he took care of her himself with medicines he bought at different pharmacies, with cold compresses, with the constant terror that she would die not because of the Reich, but from an infection he didn't know how to treat. She survived, but those 5 days showed Friedrich something he hadn't considered. He wasn't just saving Margaret from the system, he was living with her, sharing spaces, sharing silences. And at some point, without realizing it, he had started to care about her beyond the paper that united them. The months passed, and the winter of 1944 was brutal. News from the Eastern Front was getting worse and worse. The Soviets were advancing. The Americans were bombing German cities with increasing precision. The Reich was beginning to collapse, but still had enough strength to kill those it considered internal enemies. In January 1945, Friedrich received a direct order. All Jewish population records had to be consolidated and sent to Berlin for final processing. They didn't specify what that meant. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. Friedrich reviewed the files for 3 nights straight. Margaret appeared on at least 4 different lists. Her name was in forced labor records, in old racial censuses, in previous relocation files. But she didn't appear on the most recent consolidated list, the one being sent to Berlin, because Friedrich had achieved something almost impossible. He had created an inconsistency so complex within the system that the system itself no longer knew how to classify her. Margaret existed and didn't exist at the same time. She was registered, but in categories that contradicted each other, and while Berlin officials tried to resolve that contradiction, she remained alive. It was enough. Barely, but enough. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Reich fell. Administrative offices were occupied by Soviet troops. Archives were confiscated, burned, or transferred to Moscow. The system that had controlled millions of lives for 12 years ceased to exist in a matter of days. Friedrich and Margaret survived, but not as heroes, but as shadows. The marriage that had saved them was never dissolved, nor was it celebrated. It simply continued existing in the records of the new order. To the outside world, they were a common German marriage that had passed the war in silence. Nobody asked, nobody investigated, nobody wanted to stir up the past. In 1947, Thomas Steiner was born, only child of the marriage. He was registered without complications. There were no special marks on his birth certificate, no references to Margaret Waldman or her disappeared family. To the state, Thomas was simply German. Margaret never spoke of the past, never mentioned her brother David, never visited the places where she had grown up, never looked for answers about what had happened to her father Jakob, who had probably died in a camp she would never know. It was as if the years before 1944 had been erased from her memory. Friedrich didn't speak either, not with Margaret, not with Thomas, not with anyone. The marriage certificate remained kept in a drawer, but they never looked at it. It was just a paper that had saved them and that now seemed unnecessary. They lived decades like this, in Zwickau first, then in a smaller city near the border with Poland. Friedrich worked as an archivist in a municipal library. Margaret worked as a freelance translator, always from home, always in silence. She translated technical texts from German to Polish, and vice versa. She never taught philosophy again. Thomas grew up without really knowing who his mother was before 1944. He knew she was Jewish, he knew she had survived, but he didn't know how, and when he asked, his parents responded with silences that he learned not to break. The past was a tacit agreement of silence, and that silence lasted almost 60 years. On March 12, 2004, Friedrich received a letter. It wasn't ordinary mail. It was a large sealed envelope sent from Zwickau with official sender Dr. Matthias Richter, lawyer specialized in historical archive recovery from the National Socialist period. Friedrich was 92 years old and lived alone. Margarete had died 3 years earlier in 2001 after a brief illness. Thomas lived in another city and visited him occasionally. Friedrich's life had been reduced to simple routines: reading, walking, remembering the minimum necessary. He opened the letter with trembling hands, and inside there were 3 documents. The first was a handwritten letter signed by Dr. Richter. The second was a copy of a death certificate dated February 2004. The third was a notarized will drafted in 1998. Dr. Richter's letter explained the following. David Waldman, Margaret Waldman's brother, had survived the war, had changed his identity in 1945, adopting the name David Brenner, and had worked as a rural doctor in a remote village in Thuringia for over 50 years. He never married, never had children, never revealed his true name. He died in February 2004 at 83 years old. In his will, he left clear instructions. The whole truth about his survival had to be delivered to Friedrich Conrad Steiner, if he was still alive, but only after his death, not before, because David needed to die before the truth could be told without consequences. Dr. Richter had located Friedrich after weeks of searching in municipal archives, and now delivered to him what David had kept for decades. The letter continued, and Friedrich felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. David explained that in 1944, when he disappeared from Breslau, he hadn't been deported. He had been hidden by an underground network of German doctors who operated in military hospitals and who falsified identity documents for Jews who could pass as Aryans. The network was composed of 17 doctors and nurses distributed in 5 different hospitals. They operated without central coordination, without visible leaders, without written documents. Each member knew only 2 or 3 more people. If one fell, the rest kept functioning. David had been one of the saved. They had given him a new name, new papers, and had sent him to the Eastern Front as a field doctor under false identity. He worked for 11 months in a field hospital near Warsaw, treating war wounds, amputations, infections. He saw German soldiers die every day and knew that if anyone discovered who he really was, he would die too. He survived but couldn't return because returning meant revealing the network that had saved him, and revealing the network meant condemning dozens of people to death. So David Brenner remained David Brenner until the day of his death. But that wasn't all. In his letter, David revealed something Friedrich had never known. The marriage between Friedrich and Margaret had not only saved her, it had saved 3 other people, because the marriage certificate that Friedrich had discreetly filed in October 1944 was used as a model by 2 other officials within the same office, officials who knew Friedrich, who trusted his method, and who replicated the strategy with other Jewish women in similar situations. One of those false marriages saved a woman named Hannah Goldstein, 31 years old, who worked as a legal assistant before being fired due to racial laws. Another saved Clara Rosenberg, 25 years old, linguist specialized in Slavic languages. Hannah married an official named Klaus Hoffmann in December 1944. Clara married an archivist named Martin Bergman in January 1945. Both marriages were processed using exactly the same method Friedrich had used: discrete documents, official stamps, files mixed with hundreds of other procedures. David had met Hannah years after the war in 1953 when they both worked in nearby hospitals in Saxony. She told him her story. He investigated discreetly and discovered that the method that had saved his sister had been replicated without Friedrich knowing it. Hannah told him that Klaus Hoffmann had explained to her that he had seen how Friedrich processed certain documents with deliberate delays, how he generated technical inconsistencies, how he used the system's contradictions against the system itself. Klaus decided to try the same, and it worked. Martin Bergman did something similar with Clara. He never spoke directly with Friedrich, but had noticed the discrepancies in the files and understood what they meant. It wasn't a single act. It was a crack within the system, a crack that expanded silently, saving lives that were never counted. David wrote in his will that he had spent decades trying to decide whether to tell the truth or not. He feared that revealing it would put Friedrich in danger during the post-war years when denazification tribunals still operated and any link with the regime could be used as an accusation. He also feared that Friedrich wouldn't want to know, that he would prefer to live without that weight. But in the end, David decided that the truth should be delivered not as an accusation nor as gratitude, but as recognition, because Friedrich had not only been a man who married a Jew to save her, he had been a point of failure within a system that believed itself perfect, and that failure had allowed others to act. Dr. Richter ended his letter with a simple note: Mr. Steiner, I don't know if you were looking for this, I don't know if you needed it, but David Waldman believed you had the right to know that your decision of October 1944 didn't end in your office. It had consequences that escaped your control, and because of those consequences, at least 6 people you never met remained alive after 1945. Hannah Goldstein had 2 children, Clara Rosenberg had 3, Margaret had 1. Those 6 people in turn had 11 grandchildren, and those 11 grandchildren have had so far 17 great-grandchildren, 37 lives that exist because you signed a paper in October 1944. Friedrich read the letter 3 times, then left it on the table, closed his eyes, and remained motionless for several minutes. He didn't cry, didn't feel relief, didn't feel pride. He felt something more complex, something that had no name, because for 60 years he had lived with the certainty that he had saved one person, Margaret, and that had been enough to justify the risk he took. Now he understood that reality had been different, that his silent act had generated an effect he never controlled, that other people had seen what he did and had decided to imitate it, that the Reich, so obsessed with absolute control, had failed not because of an act of massive resistance, but because of individual decisions that the system couldn't track in time. Friedrich wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He hadn't fought. He hadn't risked his life in battle. He hadn't given speeches against Hitler, but he had broken the Reich from within with a stamp, with a paper, with a signature, and that somehow had been enough. Thomas arrived at his father's house 3 days after the letter. Friedrich showed him the documents without long explanations. He only told him, "Your mother had a brother. He survived and died a few weeks ago." Thomas read everything in silence, read David's letter, read the will, read the names, Hannah Goldstein, Clara Rosenberg, Klaus Hoffman, Martin Bergman, read about the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, then asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Friedrich took time to respond, finally said, "Because I didn't know." That was the last long conversation they had about the subject. Thomas tried to investigate more, contacted Dr. Richter, searched for files about Hannah Goldstein and Clara Rosenberg, found some records, confirmed that both had survived, that both had built lives after the war. Hannah had been a history teacher in Dresden until her retirement in 1982. Clara had immigrated to Israel in 1948 and had founded an organization to help Holocaust survivors. But he didn't find direct traces connecting those false marriages with Friedrich because the documents had been destroyed, because the officials who replicated the method never left written records, because everything had occurred in the final chaos of the Reich, when the system no longer had time to verify each inconsistency. Friedrich never sought recognition, never contacted the families of the women who had supposedly been saved using his method, never spoke with historians, never wrote memoirs, lived his last years in the same silence in which he had lived the previous 60. He died on November 7th, 2006, at 94 years old in his home alone while sleeping. Thomas organized a small funeral. 6 people attended. There were no speeches, no posthumous medals, no official recognitions. The marriage certificate that Friedrich had signed in October 1944 was found among his belongings. It was folded, yellowed, but intact. Thomas kept it in a box along with David's letters and Dr. Richter's. He never knew exactly what to do with it. In 2010, Dr. Richter published an academic article titled "Bureaucratic Failures in Racial Classification of the Third Reich, Cases of Civil Marriages as Survival Strategy." The article mentioned 3 documented cases of marriages between German officials and registered Jewish women. Between 2010, 1943, and 1945, one of those cases was Friedrich and Margaret's. The article didn't have great repercussion. It was read mainly by historians specialized in Holocaust studies, didn't generate headlines, wasn't cited in documentaries, remained filed in a university library in Leipzig. But in 2018, an Israeli historian named Miriam Levinson, granddaughter of Clara Rosenberg, read the article while researching her grandmother's history, contacted Dr. Richter, requested access to the archives, and confirmed that the marriage that had saved her grandmother had been processed in the same office where Friedrich Steiner worked just 2 months after Friedrich and Margaret's marriage. Miriam tried to locate Thomas. It took her months to find him. When they finally spoke by phone, she told him, "Your father saved my grandmother without knowing it, and my grandmother saved hundreds of people after the war. She founded an organization that helped survivors find family members, rebuild their lives, emigrate to Israel, all because someone like your father decided to use the system against itself." Thomas didn't know what to respond, only nodded in silence on the other end of the line. "Can I come visit you?" asked Miriam. Thomas accepted. They met 2 weeks later in a Berlin cafe. Miriam showed him photos of her grandmother, told him how she had lived in a kibbutz for 20 years, how she had raised 3 children alone after her husband died in 1956, how she had dedicated her life to helping other survivors. Thomas showed the marriage certificate of his parents, showed her David's letter, showed her the will. Miriam cried. Thomas didn't, because he had inherited his father's silence. In 2020, in a private ceremony in Jerusalem, the name of Friedrich Conrad Steiner was included in a memorial of people who acted against the Holocaust without being part of official resistance organizations. He wasn't declared righteous among the nations because the technical criteria didn't completely apply, but his name was inscribed on a plaque along with other names of officials, workers, and German civilians who, in silence, had broken the system from within. Thomas traveled to Jerusalem for the ceremony, saw his father's name engraved in stone, also saw the names of Hannah Goldstein and Clara Rosenberg, and saw at the end of the plaque a phrase in Hebrew and German, "Whoever saves one life saves the entire world." Thomas remained in front of the plaque for several minutes, then returned to Germany, never spoke publicly about his father again because he understood something Friedrich had known. Silence doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means respect. Sometimes it means there are truths that don't need to be shouted to exist. Today, the marriage certificate between Friedrich Conrad Steiner and Margaret Waldman is filed in the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. It's not on public display. It's in the research archives, available only to historians with authorized access. It's just a paper, a yellow document signed in black ink, stamped with an official Reich stamp. But that paper represents something bigger than its materiality. It represents the idea that even within the most brutal systems there are always cracks, and that those cracks can be used not by epic heroes nor by charismatic leaders, but by ordinary people who make extraordinary decisions without really knowing what consequences they will have. Friedrich Conrad Steiner didn't destroy the Reich, didn't save millions, didn't change the course of the war, but he saved 6 people the system had marked to die, and those 6 people lived, had children, had grandchildren, built lives the Reich wanted to erase. And that, in the end, was enough. Because the Reich fell, the archives were burned, the names were forgotten, but the lives continued, and they continued because someone at some point decided that a paper could mean the difference between existing and disappearing. If you know someone from your city and country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. If you want to support more content like this, consider joining as a channel member. And if this video moved you, click the thanks button to help the channel keep growing. Perhaps the next invisible hero is yours.